This is Embodied from PRX and WUNC. I'm Anita Rao. Curtis Chin grew up, for the most part, inside Chung's Cantonese Cuisine, his family's restaurant in Detroit.
When you're a little kid, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers. My dad gave us the exact opposite advice because my dad was a guy who grew up in Chinatown. He never left. He didn't know what opportunities existed outside of the four walls of that Chinese restaurant, but he knew that he had this dining room full of people who did.
Chung's was the backdrop for many of Curtis's formative lessons about race, sexuality, and belonging.
I was conscious that there were all these different types of people who had different values and different ways of seeing the world. And so for me, it really was a question of knowing that I'm Asian American, knowing that I'm gay, how do I fit into this mosaic?
How being a restaurant kid helped Curtis find his own way, just ahead on Embodied.
Hey, Amanda Magnus here, the executive producer of Embodied. Each week on the show, we introduce you to interesting people and bring you into intimate topics that inspire meaningful conversations. But these episodes are only possible with the support of our community. And that includes you. Make a contribution to the public radio station that supports our work, WUNC, so that we can continue to bring you the stories you can't find anywhere else. Give as generously as you can at WUNC.org, and thank you.
Curtis Chin is a restaurant kid who grew up inside his family's long-running business in Detroit, Chung's Cantonese Cuisine. To him, it was like Disneyland.
It was just my playground, right? It's where my brothers and sister were, my cousins, my parents. I got all the food I wanted to eat.
The floors of the dining room were covered in carpet and the walls in antique artwork, from wooden paintings of the Chinese countryside to flying dragons. Curtis's great-grandfather first opened Chung's in 1940. And by the time Curtis was hanging out there in the 1970s and 80s, Chung's had become somewhat of an institution, a 94-seat dining room and a multicultural refuge.
There was just always people coming in, whether it's customers or just people in Chinatown coming into the back kitchen. And so it just felt like this wonderful cauldron of people and ideas and energies.
It was there at Chung's that Curtis says he learned everything he needed to know. Lessons about family, identity, and belonging. This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and health. I'm Anita Rao. Curtis Chin is now in his mid-50s and has built a career as a filmmaker, organizer, and writer. A few years ago, he published his first memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. When Curtis was growing up, his parents worked up to 80 hours a week inside that restaurant, which meant that Curtis and his siblings spent a ton of time there, after school, on weekends, and most of the summers. And as a kid, Curtis says he spent a lot of his time literally trying to find a place to sit.
I think it comes from just being in a crowded family. I mean, I had 5 siblings, my 2 parents, my 2 grandparents also living at home. It was just so many people there all the time. And it was difficult, frankly, to just find a place to sit down, a place to just collect your thoughts or be by yourself. And so you really had to compartmentalize.
How did you feel about your place in the family lineup? You were third out of 6 kids. Were you very middle child-esque, or what was your experience?
My siblings and I were kind of merciless to each other. And so we'd get together every month and just sort of discuss who are mom and dad's favorites. And we'd actually come up with our own Nielsen ratings, who was in first place. And I was always last.
Aww.
Because I was the only one that didn't necessarily have this thing that my parents could trumpet and say oh, this is Curtis. He's the ... Except when it came time and I became the gay one. But that wasn't necessarily something that they would trumpet. So finding a way to sort of define myself and figure out how I fit into this world was definitely something I was trying to do as a kid.
Let's talk about the many worlds that existed inside of the restaurant. You mentioned earlier kind of the back kitchen. That was the space where the women and children often were. And then the men were in the dining room interacting with customers. Talk to me about these worlds within Chung's and who occupied each space.
Yeah, so growing up, my grandmother, who dominated the whole space, she was the matriarch. She had a rule that kids should not be seen. And so that's why we were tucked away in the back kitchen. So my earliest memories were hanging around in this very female dominated space because it wasn't just my grandmother, it was my mom, it was the aunties that were helping to make the egg rolls and to make the almond cookies. But I loved it because it was just a great smell, and it was always fun to experiment and just play around. And that's the one thing that my parents are pretty good about because they knew that we were there for so many hours. They didn't necessarily have constraints.
So your mom kind of encourages you to have a sense of play. She seemed to have a real soft spot for you. That was the sense that I got in the book. Would you describe your relationship with your mom and kind of how she managed that sphere of the restaurant?
Well, that's very interesting that you say that, because I definitely didn't feel like my mom's favorite. But I did have a special connection with my mom because she always said that I was the lucky one. And the way she came about that was, I mean, first was little kids, we'd play mahjong, right? Like in the back table and stuff like that. And I always won. Or it just seemed like good things would happen. Like, for instance, when I was really young, I think I was like 3 or 4 years old, I got lost in Hudson's department store, and I had to find my way out. And I didn't panic. And I think after that, she just really trusted me to be independent. And so she didn't hover over me as much as maybe some of the others.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that articulation totally makes sense. And then we have your dad who is in the front of the house, Big Al, seems like this gregarious character, and you describe him as the quintessential Chinese waiter. What does that mean? And what did that look like in practice? Like, who was he in this space?
Well, yeah. So, as I got into my, preteen years and we started spending more time in the dining room, that's when I got to know my dad better. And so seeing my dad working the dining room, making friends with everybody, sitting down and chatting was just a really eye-opening experience for me. When you're a little kid, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers.
Hmm.
My dad gave us the exact opposite advice. He said, talk to strangers. And who he was talking about were all those people sitting in that dining room. Because my dad was a guy who grew up in Chinatown. He never left. He didn't know what opportunities existed outside of the four walls of that Chinese restaurant. But he knew that he had this dining room full of people who did. And so anytime he met somebody who he thought had a cool story or just seemed really happy, he'd call all six of us kids to run over and barrage them with questions of, what do you do for a living? How did you get your job? How much money do you make? And it was just this really wonderful, generous way of learning how to connect with people. And that's probably the greatest lesson I've had in life. And it's what's opened up opportunities for me for a kid that grew up in the inner city of Detroit.
What's so interesting to me about your experience is that I felt like you kind of were always walking this line of being both an insider and an outsider. Like your family's restaurant was in Detroit's Chinatown. Your dad had grown up there, but you and your siblings were some of the only American born kids there. The other kids you were interacting with were newer immigrants or from newer immigrant families. And then you go to school and you're the only Asian kid in your classroom. So talk to me about that experience of kind of constantly moving in between these spaces of race and class as a kid.
Because I grew up in such a diverse setting, between black and white and Chinatown, and there was a mix of Asians in Chinatown, actually,
Hmm.
Filipino, Indian, Afghan. I mean, so I was conscious that there were all these different types of people who had different values and different ways of seeing the world. And so for me, I think one thing that people pointed out about my book is that I don't have those internal struggles culturally of like, am I Asian or am I American?
Yeah.
Because I understand what being Asian American is because my dad was born here. Do you know what I mean? So I understood that. It really was a question of knowing that I'm Asian American, knowing that I'm gay, how do I fit into this mosaic? How do I fit into this multicultural world?
What spaces did you feel most yourself? Like as you were kind of discovering all of these different emerging parts of your intersecting identity?
Where did I feel most comfortable?
Yeah.
Probably the dining room. I mean, because so my family moved from a predominantly black neighborhood to a predominantly white neighborhood, right? And so in those spaces, I always had to perform, right? There is this idea of code switching. I definitely felt like I was performing. And so I adopted certain values that weren't necessarily my values or were a heightened version of my values, I would say. But definitely being around my family, being in that dining room, there was just so much joy for me.
You didn't always love it, though. Like, you were sometimes bored.
True. Bored? Yes. Bored a lot, actually, when I
Yeah.
was a little kid. Definitely, when I, wasn't allowed to do stuff.
So you were developing this awareness of kind of who you were, who your family was, really spending a lot of time in this restaurant. But as you mentioned, you also started to experience your first real feelings of sexual desire and some clarity that those feelings were toward other boys. Who were the first top guys that kind of caught your attention?
God, the first guy was a boy named Rudy, who was a Filipino kid who was 1 year older than me. And then, it was our cook, Mr. Ma, who I even to this day, I'm like, God, he was so, you know what I mean? Like you just think of he's this,
What was he
Anyway.
like? Tell us about him.
Oh, no, 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 no.
Just paint a short picture. We need a visual.
He was just so cute, and had this really tight body. Do you know what I mean? Like he'd come from California. He was really taut and he was just so friendly, and he had this nice little giggle and just, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, my perfect body type. And he was like our fry cook, and I would just sit back there with him all the time in the back corner and just like watch him cook and just, sit and talk with him. He's just so nice. But yeah, he had a hot little body,
So you had these experiences. You knew that you were attracted to boys and men, but there was also some struggle there about how much you could accept those desires. Talk to me about that tension and how that manifested.
To me, I actually consider myself as part of that age generation, even though I wasn't in the coasts during the worst years, like in the early 80s. And so for me, the coming out experience was different in the sense that my family's Buddhist, so we don't have, I didn't experience any homophobia. I didn't have any fear that my family would judge me or kick me out or do anything like that because I was gay, right? But what I did fear was breaking their heart, or more importantly, bringing more fear and anxiety and worry to them, because I knew my parents were already really stressed out working in that Chinese restaurant in the inner city. They had so many things to already deal with. I just didn't want to burden them with this other thing because, anytime someone came out, there was this notion that you were going to get AIDS, or that was just the first step of announcing that you had AIDS and that you were going to die. I just didn't want to burden them with more struggles.
Just ahead, Curtis talks about his deepening racial consciousness and his surprising detour into Republican politics. You're listening to Embodied from WUNC, a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You can also hear Embodied as a podcast. Follow and subscribe on your platform of choice. We'll be right back. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. We're talking today with Curtis Chin, a filmmaker and author of the memoir Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. For decades, Curtis's family owned and operated Chung's Cantonese Cuisine in Detroit's Chinatown. And in 1982, when Curtis was 14 years old, something happened that rocked his community. A young Asian American man named Vincent Chin was brutally murdered.
Vincent was a Chinese American out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He goes to this strip club. These two white auto workers come in and they're overheard saying, "It's because of you mother blanks that we're out of work." They're all kicked out of the bar. And these two guys get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit trying to look for Vincent. And they see him sitting outside a McDonald's. They take a baseball bat and they bash his head in.
The racially motivated killing galvanized Asian Americans across the country. It also reshaped Curtis's understanding of race and place in a black and white Detroit. But when it first happened, Curtis's understanding of the incident was mostly personal.
Our families were close friends. My uncle was his best man. And we found out about it the very next morning, that Saturday morning, that he was in the hospital struggling for his life. And for me, it was just someone I knew that was in the hospital fighting for his life. And I'd heard about violence in Detroit already because it was a very violent city. I knew other people that had been murdered, but this one hit particularly close just because we shared the same last name. We're in the same family association, and so I really was curious about what had happened to him. And so I checked the newspapers. Nobody reported on it that next day. Nothing on TV, nothing on the radio. I checked the next day, nothing. I checked the next day again, nothing. I checked for 12 straight days. There was nothing in the newspaper about this story. Meanwhile, everybody was coming to our restaurant trying to find out what happened. Also because we had the gambling den in our basement, but that's another story. But they were coming in and just, wanting to know these details. And that contrast between what the mainstream media was covering and what our community cared about really stuck out at me, especially several months later when the judge came back and only fined these guys $3,000 and they didn't have to serve a single day in jail. And his rationale was, you don't put these type of people in jail. And I guess what he was referring to was white middle class people with jobs, right?
You say in your book that before this moment, you had felt really secure as an Asian American, but then things changed. What shifted for you after Vincent's murder?
Well, I think it was this idea of being the outsider and always believing in the justice system, and then suddenly realizing that maybe they don't see us as equal people because, like I said, how do you literally kill somebody and then only get $3,000 fine? And I think that the thing that stuck out with me was again the media coverage versus what our community cared about, and you know, the other contrasting thing was that the stories that the media was covering at that time were about the white auto workers and how so many of them had lost their jobs and were struggling. And because you had all this built-in empathy for these killers, you could see why they could walk away.
Hmm.
And so that's what it stirred in me, was this notion of like, well, we need to tell our stories. People need to know who we are, right? The stories are so important because again, this connects to my dad being in that dining room telling me to talk to people, hear their stories, understand who they are. And to me, that's why I said, okay, well, you know what? People need to hear our stories. They need to hear our side of it. And so I literally grabbed the typewriter from the back kitchen and lugged it into the dining room and started writing these letters to the editor. It was my first act of activism, of community organizing, or whatever you might call it. But it was the first time I just felt like I need to stand up for our community. I need to make sure that people understand who we are. So yeah, it was pivotal.
What's so shocking to me, or surprising to me, I guess, in hearing you retell that and thinking about kind of where this fit into your life story is you were having this awakening. And I'm reading your memoir and I'm like, oh, I know what's about to happen. Like, I know the direction his politics are going. And then your politics went in the exact opposite direction to what I expected. You started to really resonate with the Republican Party and its messaging and kind of became a proud Republican kid. So talk to me about that and what was happening for you, these emerging political beliefs, while you were also feeling this strong sense of, I don't know, disconnect from what other people were experiencing and a need to articulate yourself and your identity as an Asian American.
Okay, so I'm thinking about this right now, like in two different ways, right? Because I
Yeah.
did have a split life in the sense of at that time, I was going to school that was 98% white,
Uh-huh.
right? And so for me, how did I fit in? I said, okay, I will become the Asian Alex P. Keaton, right? Which is the character from Family Ties. I was class president, president of the National Honor Society. I co founded the Young Republican Club, the Students Against Smoking. Margaret Thatcher was my imaginary girlfriend.
I can't
That
believe
was
that. That's so funny.
no, I was a total right winger. You would not like me. I was pretty awful. You know, but that's how I felt like I could survive in that world. Now, being at a Chinese restaurant in the inner city, where that neighborhood is a lower income area, and I think that you approach some of these political issues slightly differently when you're a small business owner
Hmm.
working in these communities. On one hand, you're part of that community, but also because of the power dynamics where you do own a business in there, it's a little bit more nuanced in the sense of our relationship to the police, our relationship to law and order. You know what I mean?
That's so interesting, even though you felt like the way the justice system treated Vincent's killers was not fair. Like you really like were holding all of these contradictions.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I haven't even thought about it. You're right. On one hand, I didn't think that just the system was fair, right, to him. Maybe I thought like maybe that was more the court system and then maybe the police. But I don't know. I mean, maybe we're all filled with contradictions, right? And they're always based off of real life experiences. And sometimes we don't take a step back and sort of reconcile these different things. But for me, I do feel like maybe it was also the idea of being a Republican of that I don't want to say myth that they say about
Mm.
like pull yourself up from your bootstraps
Yeah.
type of idea, and that really resonated with me too. That idea because when you come from an immigrant household, that's what these people teach you, right? It's like work hard and you will succeed, right? So in that sense, I still do believe in hard work, right, as a way of getting ahead. But I also am now aware of this other half, which is, despite that, there is still this thing called systematic racism and institutional racism, which has to be overcome, right? So in my world, the solution is tackling both, right? Like how do you get people to have individual agency to overcome things, and at the same time, how do you tackle these greater barriers, which levels the playing field so that when those people put in that effort, they feel like they're being treated with the same opportunities that others have.
So there was a lot happening for you in those years, and you say in your memoir that with the distractions of everything happening in Detroit, you had sort of pushed off dealing with your sexuality, tried to kind of shove down the thoughts and feelings, but they did keep kind of creeping back in. They did kind of keep coming back up to the surface, and you were sort of tracking how your parents responded to mentions of gayness. You were really kind of tracking your environment to see if and how you could fit. Tell me about that and what was going on for you as this tension was building between pushing your feelings down, but also knowing that your sexuality was what it was.
Yeah, so to some degree, I was testing my parents to sort of see how they would respond, how they felt about gay issues, and did they, like for instance, when we were watching television and there was a news report about AIDS, I really wanted to see how my mom, would respond to that, and I have to give them credit; they always passed the test. There was another scene in my book where my mom was friendly with the prostitutes in the neighborhood, right? And I just pushed her. I'm like, "Well, do you know what they're doing for work? You know how they're making a living?" And she's like, "Yeah, they're just working like everybody else. They need to make a living."
Hmm.
And it's just like, whoa, you don't think that, you know, um, a Chinese woman, immigrant woman, would have such a progressive view on sex workers.
Well, because
Like,
your
but
restaurant was inside the red light district, right? So how did that proximity kind of affect your own understanding of sex and sexuality?
yeah, so when they say the bad part about Detroit, we were in the bad part of Detroit. I
Uh-huh.
mean, literally, if you look at the crime stats, our precinct was the most crime, out of the whole city of Detroit. It was just really a bad area. But I think prostitution and sex work were the least of the problems
Hmm.
when people are getting murdered. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or when buildings are burning down, or when, I guess drugs probably seem like a worse issue, right? And you'd see junkies and stuff like that on the streets. And then even homeless people, I think, seem to be a bigger issue. I think that's the context of, why maybe my mom was so libertarian about these things. It's like she's not worried about that. She's worried about safety. She's worried about her kids, you know, um, getting drugs. She's worried about like getting our kids getting shot. She's worried about all these other things.
So having these a restaurant space where you had a customer base that was diverse, you were down the street from a drag bar and you had experiences kind of serving a whole variety of clientele. And I want you to tell us about this experience that you had as you got older. You were a waiter and there was one evening where you were helping out in the front room and a gay couple came in, one of whom was dressed in drag, and the evening kind of evolved in an unexpected way. Will you tell me about that and what you took away from that encounter?
Yeah, so the beauty of the restaurant was that we literally saw the whole city of Detroit coming into our restaurant. Everybody from Mayor Coleman Young, the first black mayor, to the pimps and prostitutes, in that neighborhood. But in terms of that specific incident that you're talking about, is like I was at an age where I was struggling with my sexual identity vis-a-vis AIDS, right? Because everything that you ever heard about, gay people was that they were ill, they were dying, they had been kicked out by their family. It was a very bleak representation for gay people. And then one night, this one couple comes in and they're just laughing and having a wonderful time. And for the first time, I did not think of being gay as a death sentence. I
Hmm.
thought, like, wow, you can actually laugh as a gay person. And so I spent a lot of attention, on them and giving them free stuff, which my grandmother would have hated. But, it was just really being very attentive to them. And then as I was going back to put their order in, the drag queen or the female impersonator, I think that's what they were called back then, just shouted across the floor, like, you better not be serving us dog meat. I'm like, whoa. I'd gone from this joy and excitement of feeling I'd found my people to this like really low of like, you racist piece of, you know, and so I think that sometimes life surprises you like that, right?
Hmm.
Like finding that security. It's like you hope for certain things and maybe they don't always turn out. And yet how do you navigate these weird emotions, these conflicting emotions? Because life can be pretty messy sometimes.
Yeah, I really felt for you when reading that story because it felt like you were trying so often to kind of observe the world to see whether it was safe for you to be a certain version of yourself, like watching your mom watch the news and saying, "Okay, it could be safe for me to kind of be gay with her," or then watching in the restaurant and like, "Okay, it could be safe." And then you kind of had your heart broken when like things didn't turn out as you expected. Like, did you feel like you could kind of be all the parts of yourself at that point, or like how were you feeling about your various identities?
Um, I never had the internal conflicts of feeling like I'm because I actually think of code switching as actually a good skill set. I'm not one of
Hmm.
those people who feel like, oh, it's a negative thing. I'm split. I feel like being able to code switch and adapt and things like that actually opens up new worlds for you because it says that you can relate and you can fit into different situations. And I've always just felt like that's a wonderful trait to have. And it gives me opportunities. Having grown up, I guess what you would say bicultural or a third culture kid, is that the term that people use?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I actually think these are wonderful things. I don't think of them as negative drawbacks. And some people do because they feel like, "Oh, I don't want to be split. I want to be a whole person. I want to be my own entity." But we wear different hats all the time in different spaces, and that doesn't mean that it inherently challenges us, right? As long as at the deep core we know who we are, then it's basically just about grabbing from a grab bag of different skills, right, and tricks that you can use.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that frame on it before. I'm curious, like, does that come without any grief for you, or do you just kind of accept that grief is a part of existing in both of these identities?
Grief, I
Grief
didn't
in the
think of
sense that, like, I guess thinking back to that restaurant story, the moment of being like, "Oh, wow, okay, so, like, I can be gay with in this space, but I can't, they're not gonna necessarily accept me as an Asian American." Like, that there are times when the coexistence of those identities isn't met with warmth.
the challenge for me is, I accept the world that this is the way it is,
Mhm.
right? I mean, maybe that's a Buddhist philosophy, is like, the world is shitty, so how are you gonna deal with it, right? So for me, it was always just navigating like, well, how do I address these things? This is the way it is. I mean,
Mm.
and I do think this more so as an adult now, and I wonder if I thought this way as a kid as well, is that I loved growing up in a multicultural world, a society, that dining room, right? I loved meeting different peoples all the time. And so if that meant the occasional drawback is that I would experience some racism, some homophobia, some gender discrimination, some religious discrimination, or whatever, it was worth it for the trade off, for the opportunity to meet other people. So I say that about living in America, this multicultural society, right? Is that racism, homophobia, all these things are always going to be around, right? Because we all come from these different cultures. We all have these different traditional sets of values that sort of inform the way we look at the world, right? And so I accept that racism is part of America, but I think for me the trade-off of a multicultural society where we can learn from different people and experience different cultures in our own backyard, I think is worth it, right?
So as you kind of grew up, you go away to college not too far. You go to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. How were your politics shifting? Like, are you still a member of the Republican Club at this time, or how are your politics evolving as you became a young adult?
Well, first of all, I didn't want to go to college, right?
Yeah.
I'm considered a first generation college kid. And given everything that I'd seen growing up, all that death and all that destruction, everything, I just didn't understand the value of sitting in a classroom for 4 more years. But my mom, who was an immigrant and wanted us to get out of the inner city, really focused on education. She really pushed us to work hard. And so I rationalized what would be me giving up 4 years of my life for a woman who's given up her whole life for me. And so I made a deal with her. I said, okay, mom, I'll apply to college, but I'll only apply to one school. And if I don't get in, I'm not going. Right. And she's, okay, fine. You apply to Michigan. And I applied to Michigan, and sadly, I got in. And so I went off to college. Didn't know what I was going to study. I also had to work full time because I had to pay for college. And so I would take these night courses. And at night, there just seems to be a lot of creative writing courses being offered at 6 p.m. And I did the math and I said, okay, if I only studied poetry and I wrote haikus, I could graduate in fewer than 500 words. And so that was my whole idea of college, you know.
An immigrant
So I
parent's
just,
dream, their kid majoring in poetry. Yeah.
at least it was an Asian poetry, you know, but anyway, so within that context, I really was just focusing, and I was working full time, like I had a full time job, and I went to school at night. So the idea of how did my politics shift, it was difficult because Michigan is a traditionally very liberal school, and so I remained a Republican, but there were three policies, that shifted my positions a bit, and they all started with the letter A. The first one was apartheid. I didn't understand how Reagan supported a clearly racist system to me. The second one was AIDS. At the time, the Republicans were pushing this thing called compassionate conservatism, which I totally could get, right? Because as Buddhists, we're taught to be compassionate. But when I'd go to Republican meetings, they weren't compassionate. Right? And so clearly there was a disconnect there. And the third eventually was abortion because, I had these hallmates, these two women who just kept haranguing me every meal, saying, "How can you be a member of that party? They're so awful." I was still in the closet at that time, granted, but still as a person of color, they're like, "How can you be a part of this?" Da 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 da. And they finally made me see the light of day when they said it's just about controlling our bodies. And for me, I made that connection. Said, well, that's all I want to do too. I just want to control my body. And the event that really switched me off was the Republican National Convention in Houston in 1992, when Pat Buchanan came on and just really was very anti-gay, and just that's when I left the party officially and said, I cannot be a Republican anymore.
Just ahead, we'll talk about how Curtis found space for all of his intersecting identities in adulthood and had to make some difficult choices about the future of his family's restaurant. As always, you can hear the podcast version of this show by following Embodied on your platform of choice. We'll be right back.
How does AI even work? Where does creativity come from? What's the secret to living longer? TED Radio Hour explores the biggest questions with some of the world's greatest thinkers. They will surprise, challenge, and even change you. Listen to NPR's TED Radio Hour wherever you get your podcasts.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Curtis Chin was a restaurant kid who came of age as a gay Asian American boy in Detroit in the 1970s and 80s. He's been telling us about the ups and downs of navigating his place in his family and his many identities. But as he moved into adulthood, the search for belonging got easier.
Once you come out to yourself and you accept who you are, the rest of it are just, additional hurdles, right? Whether it's coming out to your parents or extended relatives, you're constantly always having to come out.
After coming out to some of his friends and siblings, Curtis decided to jump that final hurdle in his 20s and came out to his parents.
The coming out was actually an accident, so it's a kind of a funny accident. So, you know, um, it really was kind of unplanned. But at the same time, what happened afterwards, after that happened, was my parents met up with a couple of their customers. This upwardly mobile gay white couple. One was a doctor and one was a university administrator, and they just filled my parents' head with all the worst stereotypes about gay people. Like, oh, he's gonna have a good life. He's gonna go to the museums and theater. You know what I mean? Like, don't worry about it. And at the end of the day, my parents, really accepted me. Like, it was like 2 days later, they literally turned around, and because at the end of the day, my parents just wanted to make sure I'd be safe and secure. And because they had this role model couple, who are some of their closest friends in Detroit, at the restaurant, this gay couple, I think that made them feel okay. And I think that's part of it too, is like the unknown, right? For a lot of families and particularly immigrant families. And that's why coming out is so important, because you can provide a role model, and it does assuage the fears that some people might have of the unknown.
Was it a journey, though, to figure out, like, this has been something that you had been keeping inside for so long, something you had been exploring on your own in your life in New York City. So to eventually kind of turn back to your family and do this, like, whether or not you felt emotionally like it wasn't a big deal, like, it is kind of a big turning point, right?
Well, I mean, later on when I'm in my 20s, I mean, it finally built to that point because, I'd moved off to New York, and I encountered a lot of success very early on in New York for whatever reasons. And so then the contrast between that world where I was out and open and just living this wonderful life, and then having to go back to Detroit, and again, being that third middle child and reoccupying that space, was different. And then eventually having to understand that, I do have to reconcile that a little bit, and partly also because by that time I had reconnected with my current husband, Jeff.
Well, yeah, you
So,
introduce us in the book to a character who you meet in college when a friend tries to set you up. Nothing comes of it. And then in the acknowledgments, the first person you think is that same Jeff. So I need to know how you two reconnected. And was he a part of your decision to come out to your parents?
yeah, so that was Jeff. I mean, so how it happened was that I was in college at my job, and this Asian American activist comes in and says, "You need to become more active." I showed up to this meeting, and they're all like, "Well, you have to date another Asian guy," and I'm like, I haven't dated anybody, so but if you find me an Asian guy, I'm happy to date him." And so they made it a mission to find me the one other gay Asian on campus. And so, but unfortunately, he was getting ready to take a break from law school. And so we met up, but we didn't really connect. And it wasn't until years later when Stonewall, the big, riot that happened, was having its 25th anniversary in New York City. And I happened to have a really large apartment at that time where I could offer free housing to 17 guys from around the country to just crash out in my living room in Manhattan. So he was one of those guys. And so that's how we reconnected, over Stonewall. We've been together for 31 years since then now.
Wow. You say in your
Yeah.
book that you hoped for a partner that you could bring to your family's dinner table. Have you been able to do that with him? Like, have they accepted him into the fold?
Oh yeah, they're much nicer to him than they are to me. They contact him; he's fully integrated into it. Partly, and this is my excuse, is because I travel a lot for my book. They never know what time zone I'm in, so that's why it's very easy for them just to, because they know where Jeff is. Jeff is here in LA. They know he's on Pacific time, so that's my excuse.
So I want to get back to the story of Chung's, your family's restaurant, and kind of track the parallel timelines of what was happening with the restaurant and with you. So after college, you moved to New York City to pursue writing, and your family opens a second Chung's location in the suburbs. In the late 1990s, you moved to LA to work as a television writer. And then in 2005, you get a phone call that your parents have been involved in a really bad car accident. Tell me what happened from there.
I get this terrible phone call, like you said, and my parents are in a car accident, and my dad passed away, and my mom was severely injured. And my brother Chris, the golden child, immediately whisked her out to California to help her, right? Because he's a doctor now. And by the end of that week, all my other siblings decided they were also going to leave and go to California to help my mom. And I was left behind trying to decide, what do I do? Do I go back to LA and continue this pursuit of TV writing, which wasn't easy for Asian Americans back then, right? Because there were just no shows. Or do I stay in Detroit and take over this restaurant that was founded by my great grandfather in 1940? So after the car accident, I was back home in Detroit, and I was the one, entrusted to figure out what to do with it. I don't know how it fell onto my shoulders. Maybe because I was wrapping up on a TV show at that time and I had time to sort of be back there, but I was the one who had to spearhead all that. And I was back in Detroit for a whole year,
Hmm.
right? Going back and forth, but primarily just how do you get this place to sell? Detroit was really struggling back then, right? Nobody was buying any businesses. And I knew I had to get a good price for it because that was the only savings my mom had, right? That was going to be her nest egg, and so there was this pressure to not like just sell it in a fire sale because my mom needed that money, and at the same time, these emotional struggles of like how do I adapt back because I hadn't worked in the restaurant in a good 15 years, right? I'm not blue collar in that sense anymore. I'm not working with my hands. I'm sitting in a writer's room
Hmm.
using my brain, right? And so it's like that cultural shock for me. But also at the same time, when I was growing up in the restaurant, it was all our extended family members, who were there. Now suddenly there's this restaurant with, other different types of Chinese people with different regions and also other Asians, who were working there too. It's not the same childhood that I had, and so it was all that adjustment, and,
And you're grieving. Like, you're grieving the loss of your father, who was this huge figure running this space. Like, what were you thinking about in terms of him and what he would have wanted for the restaurant?
yeah, my dad definitely would have wanted us to, continue with it, right? He never forced us to, but I think he would have wanted to because by the time it got to him, he was the 3rd generation, right? And he loved that place. So I think he would have loved to see it continue on. But in terms of the grieving process, we all grieve differently. And people have actually said to me, people who read, the early drafts of that manuscript were like, why don't you cry more? Like, why don't you show more emotion? And I said, oh, well, maybe that's not how I was really raised, right? To me, the way I show my love for my family is to keep it together,
Hmm.
is to make sure that my mom is taken care of, right? To make sure that she will be fine. And I felt like that's where I was devoting my energy. I mean, that's part of the thing too, is like I don't know if I had time to grieve my dad so much because we were also so focused on my mom, like in making sure that she recovered. And so it wasn't the first time I actually cried, and this is in that manuscript, was Brokeback Mountain the movie,
Mm,
the gay cowboy movie.
yeah.
It just come out. And the first time I cried was like going to see that movie in a darkened theater by myself. And, in that pivotal moment where he says, like, we could have had a good life, I just started crying, in that one scene where, they talk about the life they could have had. I just started bawling like at that time. And I'm sure everybody thought that I was, eventually crying for that couple in Jake Gyllenhaal, but I was crying for my dad at that time.
So we have you kind of located in this moment of making this transition between, writing and being in the restaurant. You do go back to writing and filmmaking, but there was a big shift in you internally in the kind of work that you wanted to do. Tell me about that shift and what was changing for you.
I decided that I wanted to be more in control of the type of stories I was telling. And so I decided to go back to LA and not stay in Detroit to sell the restaurant. I would go back to LA, but I would work on independent films in particularly a documentary about the Vincent Chin murder. Because I thought back, like, what would be a story my dad would want me to tell? And because he
Mm.
was friends with Vincent, I thought, like, okay, that'll be a story that my dad would be proud of me spending time working on. And so that's what I did. And I didn't think I would be leaving TV permanently. I always thought of it as just temporarily while I told some stories that I wanted. But that's turned into like a 15-year journey where I've primarily been doing independent documentaries.
I want to go back
Um,
to the Vincent Chin documentary for a
okay.
second because I'm really curious what it was like to return to that as an adult. Like you'd seen that story firsthand from your kid point of view at age 14, watched the difference between what your community experienced and what was reported. What was it like to return to that as a filmmaker with the decades of context that you then had?
Much like the passing of my dad, always try to move forward and what is the light in the situation because
Hmm.
that's what we're taught to do is like find the light in it. And for me, the light in the Vincent Chin case was just this idea of a pan-Asian, political movement, right? And I was very invested in that even back then as a kid. And so I decided to make a documentary about that.
Well, you mentioned you kind of have gotten good at keeping your emotions at a distance. Like emotionally, what was it like to return to that story for you, if you can access that?
Well, the positive stuff is, of like, well, community building, which is important to me. Asian Americans standing up for ourselves and our civil rights is important to me. So those are the things that motivate me. And those are the things I just sort of focus on. I don't focus on the loss part because I've gone through so much in life, like even if it's more peripheral to me in my life, it's like, but I've had to learn how to move forward with all that stuff. Maybe it's a coping mechanism
Yeah.
that I've developed. And hopefully I'm not forgetful about these things, right? So moving on, hopefully I don't forget them, but I use them to infuse and inspire and motivate me. And I feel like that's what I've done. I mean, like even with the passing of my dad, I don't forget my dad, but I use the memory of him and the things he taught me. And I do ask myself, like, how would my dad deal with certain situations? But I still have that momentum, the forward momentum, right? I just carry the things with me as I push forward.
Do you still do the kind of code switching that you were doing as a teenager in your adult life? Or do you have communities that are like queer Asian communities where you can be kind of all parts of yourself?
Yeah, I do have queer communities, queer Asian communities, or just, but it's always a little bit different, right? Like, so when I'm around a bunch of, straight Asians, it's different than when I'm around a bunch of white and black gay people. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
I hate to like do a hierarchical thing about these things, right? Because we all occupy all these different hats where we can be an outsider or a marginalized person. Like, so for me, obviously race, because I'm Asian, sexual identity, because I'm queer, I'm Buddhist, so I'm a religious minority, I'm working class, oftentimes dealing with people that come from families of bit more means. I would say race and class are probably bigger to me than sexual orientation of feeling like an outsider. I'm a kid from the inner city of Detroit who started, with the Detroit public schools. I mean, so I do sometimes have insecurities about that, if I have to be honest with you about that. I try not to let that get to me. But then, I always think like, well, I should be, instead of feeling insecure about it, I should actually be proud of it.
It feels like there are so many kind of contradictions that you have lived through and experienced in your life. And it seems like you don't always necessarily see it that way, but I do wonder about that. Like, as you reflect on all of this professional work that you've done, as you have the experience to kind of tell your story in your own words, is it one of contradictions for you? How would you explain that?
No, I don't think so. Like when I'm writing and I'm writing these memoirs, I'm not trying to understand myself.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to recount myself, and just say, well, these are the things that happen and let other people interpret it, whatever. And I don't make that interpretation myself and say, well, this is where I am.
How does your family feel about your telling your story on your own terms and kind of establishing this version of the family story?
Well, that's exactly it. So, my family hasn't read the book, nor did they plan to read the book. According to my siblings, my brothers, they're like, well, that's your version of the history. According to my sister, she's like, I have zero interest in learning about your sexual awakening. And so, I do think they support me, though, because every time I post on Facebook, they do hit the like button. And so I think that shows support. And they do come out to the readings. And I think particularly for my mom, who, again, has had such a tough life, and so much of her sense of self-worth, unfortunately, is tied into her kids and her kids' success. And because, all of her friends back in Detroit call her up all the time whenever they hear me or see me or something, that makes her feel good. And so I'm happy that I can give that to her. I'd feel much happier if my mom could find that internal happiness for herself, right, of her own success and her going off and doing something for herself. But because she's not able to do that for whatever reasons, I'm happy to, be that good son to make her feel like her life was, there was value, like, in terms of what she did, which was raising her 6 kids.
Well, Curtis Chen, thank you so much for the conversation, for your book, and for sharing all of these stories with us. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Curtis Chen is the author of the memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. You can find out more about him and his work at our website, embodiedwunc.org. You can also stay up to date by following us on Instagram. Our handle is @embodiedwunc. Go there to see photos of young Curtis and his family. Today's episode was produced by Gabriella Glick and edited by Amanda Magnus. Kaya Finlay is our producer. Sarah Nix provided editorial guidance for the show. Nina Scott is our intern. And Jenny Lawson, our technical director. Quilla wrote our theme music. This program is recorded at the American Tobacco Historic District. WUNC is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao.